Welcome to this episode of The Next Page, our podcast here, Library and Archives, on the subject of moving towards zero hunger. We're going to have a conversation here in the studio with Catherine Bertini on a number of issues and a number of reports that have been recently put out by the Rockefeller Foundation's Global Nutrition Security Portfolio. And Catherine Bertini, after her brilliant career in the UN and her role as Executive Director of the World Food Programme and 2003 winner of the World Food Prize, she then moved on to also helping the Rockefeller Foundation, where she is now. So, Catherine, welcome back to The Next Page. You were our guest last year, a couple of years ago, and happy to have you here again for another interesting episode. Can you tell us a little bit about your role with the Rockefeller Foundation right now?
Sure, Francesco, and thank you very much for having me again. It was a pleasure last time, and I look forward to today. At the Rockefeller Foundation, Raj Shah, who's the president, asked me after the invasion of Ukraine if I would join to give them some guidance on areas in which the foundation could be more involved. One of the many things that we did was to get involved in some policy issues, because no matter how impactful the Rockefeller Foundation could be in different places, this was going to be a short-term program. So how could we best use our resources? And the answer was, let's look at policy issues and let's look at what governments should be doing and what humanitarian organizations could be doing and others in order to make a difference. Because, we've all agreed to the goals of the SDGs, yet the hunger numbers are going the wrong way. There are more hungry people today, and the numbers are going up. There's a lot of reasons, of course. Poverty is always the bottom line problem, but COVID exacerbated that. Climate change is exacerbating that. The changes in availability based on the food that couldn't come out of Ukraine or Russia. So there are a lot of different impacts on the hunger numbers and the fact that so many more people are hungry. What can we do about that? So that's what we first looked into in several different ways.
And so I understand from what I've read to prepare for this episode that you started by gathering experts, and some reports came out that basically tell the deliberations and observations and research done in those groups. Could you tell us a little bit overall how the process was designed? What came out of these discussions with these experts on this particular issue of, reaching zero hunger?
Yes, we gathered different groups of people together to get their feedback. We've also given grants to more academic institutions. And this is what came out. The first thing was, how do we define a path to zero hunger? And we gathered a bunch of experts in the food security field. Although there were a lot of different recommendations, the biggest one that came out of that is there are too many silos, mostly in donor governments, that restrict how governments can give money for food security. In other words, some governments have programs where this is only for humanitarian, and they define humanitarian not in a broad way. This is only for development, and they define development in a very restricted way. There's very little money that just comes and says, this is for anti-hunger programs in Africa or in country X or globally. That just doesn't happen. So because of these silos, it makes it very difficult to define what it is. If it's a country that's just coming out of war and there's a school feeding program, is that a humanitarian program or is it a development program? And how long are we going to argue about that before there's money available for that program? So that's the first one, was saying, let's look at silos. The second report, which Carol Bellamy, the former head of UNICEF, chaired for us and collected a lot of different experts to talk about, all right, well, when we look at the funding sources from governments mostly, humanitarian gets the most funding. Of course, the humanitarian crises are huge, and people are dying, and it makes the front page of the newspaper. So, of course, it's going to be huge. But how can we use those funds more impactfully when it comes to building long-term capacity? So this report went back to meetings like the humanitarian summit that was held in Istanbul. And one of the issues that came out of there was, let's do more localized decision-making. Let's have more of these resources that come from generous, wealthy countries in the North be more directed by, or influenced by at least, leadership in local communities, so that we know the funding is going to go where the people who live there know it's going to be most impactful. So we reiterated that objective. And another thing that report talked about was how important it is to use these resources more sustainably. And we say, crack the silos and join the dots. So if you are putting a school feeding program together, for instance, are you thinking, and it's an emergency, a humanitarian program, are you thinking over the long term about if that's going to be able to exist once the emergency's over and the funding dries up? So how are you developing, creating that program to build in community capacity so it keeps going in the future? And then another piece of this recommendation was what kind of investments we should make in the future, and the idea that there could be some small amount of resources that are put aside from humanitarian resources for these longer-term investments.
When we look at how the international community is designed today, I remember from one of these reports, one of the clear obstacles had been defined as reliance on entrenched power structures. So does it go to mean that these entrenched power structure are those also in the multilateral space, and these basically goal of zero hunger is difficult to attain also because these power structures, what are these power structures and in what way could they get out of the trenches?
Well, there are a lot of power structures that exist over time, and they're not all bad, but yes, sometimes they make mobility more difficult. So let's look at purchasing, for instance. In order to get the most food, bang for the buck, let's say in American slang, but the most food available at the lowest price, an agency has to buy bulk from big suppliers who work through the international system of bidding and so forth. That's a good thing. But then that limits the purchasing to these big suppliers and makes it difficult to purchase from smallholder farmers, for instance, which could be more localized and which could support the local economy more. So it used to be the question of donor governments sending in food. It's not so much that anymore. It's buying food, sometimes near the source of the problem, but from big farmers. So the mechanism, and we're not making proposal for this, but to answer your question about it, some of the power structures, that's one of them. It's hard to get around because if you go to the local supplier, you need reliability, you need to be sure it's safe, you need to know that when you pay for it, it's actually going to show up on time. So there are a multitude of issues that had to get resolved.
Just to continue to look at the challenges, at least one of the report was kind of very clear on the challenges. It made me wonder if gender and the way we bring the gender dimension into this whole issue is an impediment, a strategic level for what we're trying to achieve. Of course, a number of solutions are found in connecting the gender dynamics to actually solutions, and we'll talk about that later in the conversation. But our gender, the way we do gender at systemic level, is today an obstacle to attaining zero hunger?
Well, we don't think enough about gender when we think about hunger. So you asking this question is like playing my favorite song, except it's a sad song because we still don't get it. You know, Francesco, I was a plenary speaker at the Women's Conference in 1995, and the title of my speech was Women Eat Last. And I said at the time, women are the ones that grow the food, they harvest the food, they cook the food, they prepare the food, they serve the food. But yet, in many, many cultures, they only have what's left over after they feed everybody else in the family, starting with the men and boys. Even if they all eat at the table together, they still do all that other work, the women and girls. So why isn't this even more of a women's issue when we think about listening to the local people about what they need? That means we need to listen to the cooks. We need to listen to the people who have to gather the food or find the food or buy the food because they know the prices are going up. They know the availability is less. They know they can't find any water because droughts are limiting their streams. They are the ones that we should be partnering with if, in fact, we really are going to make an impact. Because all the rest of this discussion about the SDGs and the charts and systems and even the purchasing goes out the window if we don't talk with and know the issues and needs of the cooks.
So I think this is a good place in the conversation to start looking towards solutions. I imagine this is also frustrating for our audience. You know, food security or food insecurity rather, and hunger are still there in a world that has immensely progressed on many technological things, production at scale and all of that. So I guess a lot of people who are listening to this episode say, okay, we understand these are the challenges. we imagine there are solutions. So let's open that part of discussion. And I remember that the report put out by the Rockefeller Foundation, the title was The Path to Zero Hunger. It was quite clear that there were some solutions that were easy to grasp, at least for me as a non-specialist, for example. Can you tell us more about what solutions are there that we could pursue effectively?
Sure. One, actually, that came from I'll call the Bellamy report, was to anticipate future potential problems, which we don't do enough either. And we know a lot of times what might come up. When the president of Kenya appointed Richard Leakey to be his senior cabinet member because of a lot of financial problems that the government was having, Leakey said to me, droughts here are like the equivalent of a winter. Droughts are African winters. They come often, just like you up in the north, you have winters. You've figured out how to handle it, how to work through snow. And we haven't yet figured out the different aspects about how to handle a drought. So that's really part of the anticipatory action that we're talking about. But other kind of things that came out of these reports, particularly the one that you referred to, we talked about changing the aid infrastructure, and that's going back to the silos that we talked about before. We talked about trying to do something new, something different. And this involves, of course, listening to the community, but also getting more involved in some of the new technology that's available today. We talked about really having good analysis of what is political will. Let's not keep trying to get money from a certain donor that's never going to give it because they don't like the policies of the country where the poor and hungry people are. But what are we going to do about that? We talked about investing in force multipliers. Let's find one thing that could build on another thing that could build on another thing that could end up with more actual resources. And again, back to the silos, we need funding that's much less restrictive so that there could be more use. It doesn't mean the funding is, we want you to do everything everywhere. But we think that the people on the ground need to have more leeway in terms of how they spend those dollars. We don't listen enough. And that is probably the most important finding of that first report that we did.
When we talk about listening, what springs to my mind is listening to youth as well. This is one of the layers of the global society that we tend to listen to less, although they get mentioned a lot, especially in the past few years in all sort of speeches. So I just wanted to ask you how you look at the role that youth could have in this entire matter of food insecurity and path to zero hunger, and what could be done maybe more on the practical level at all levels, global, regional, national, to motivate and engage young people in addressing this issue that is pressing. This is basically pressing. You said the numbers are going up. So what could be done to motivate them to come into the space and do something?
I think if young people, and yes, there are so many more active young people now, and that's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. And I think if young people could understand more, not only about the challenges of hunger, but two things. One, that it's fixable, and two, that there's something specific they can do. So let me talk about each of those things. The fixable part at first. You see pictures of emaciated children on television. You almost want to turn away. Okay, already. And a lot of the personal reaction is, I can't do anything about that. Or, gee, that's so awful. It's up to some big government or something to fix it. But first of all, something can be done about it. And two, we can do something about it. There are so many different organizations around the world who are actively trying to work against hunger. So somebody would have a choice, and these days we can look through the internet to find out choices. But first of all, as the person who wants to be involved, interested in domestic hunger or international hunger. Because believe me, in virtually every country, there's still hungry people that need attention, even if it's a wealthy country. So is it domestic or is it international? And then one can look up a lot of different programs. Now, if you want hands-on, some people want to give money, some people don't have money to give, they want to give action. I think one of the best approaches, frankly, are through food banks and food pantries and food delivery to people. In the United States, for instance, and throughout Europe, in many other places, there are organizations that serve meals or that send meals home, or where you can go and kind of shop for free for meals in food banks. And organizations like that are always looking for volunteers. So there's something right there at home that people can do. Internationally, of course, depending on the kind of organization that you like, and you can look up exactly what kind you want. You want somebody that works in a certain country or works just with children or elderly, or you could put in any sort of subsets and come up with names of organizations. You can double check them with Charity Navigator or one of the groups that can tell you it's a legitimate organization. Please do that. But then it's not only money that they need. They could, most of them, use your letter writing to your member of parliament or to your mayor or to your head of state in order to say, this organization is really wonderful and they're doing great things for children in country X. Please pay attention to them and give them more resources. So even if you don't have money to give, this could mean much more if the people that do have money, meaning your government, knew that there was a grassroots effort to support those issues in countries.
So there we go. There are a number of solutions, and you just indicate a few from the report, The Path to Zero Hunger. We're going to put the links into, the notes to the podcast. There is another report that I wanted to bring into this space. That is the IFPRI report, very recent, just February 2024, From Promises to Action. It's a very good and telling title for a report that basically comes down to a few implications and conclusions. And I wanted to see whether we could take our conversation to one of these conclusions, actually conclusion number 4, where they say, they focus on how global governance for food systems could be made more effective. And that came to mind as I was listening to you talking about the solution. Yeah, these solutions exist. Part of them are applicable even in my personal, local, super local sphere of action. However, how can global governance for food systems be made more effective? And there I'm talking to many Catherines, because I'm talking about the Catherine who was former WFP director. I'm talking to the Catherine that wrote that beautiful piece on leading change in the UN system, I think it was. There is still, I can still quote from that. So yeah, maybe you could combine these two Catherines and tell our audience about how we could take action in the global governance system.
What a great question. Well, first of all, just one comment on the report. Yes, IFPRI just published this report, also funded by Rockefeller Foundation, because we said to them, there have been so many commitments made by governments about ending hunger. Where are we at? I mean, the numbers are going the wrong way. So what's with these commitments? And they found, yeah, of course, yes, the numbers are going the wrong way. And then they made a chart of some of the major commitments that have made at global conferences of governments and what's been happening. And almost nothing has happened from the commitments that governments have collectively made that are all part of moving toward the SDG 2 about ending hunger. So yes, one of the questions comes to your specific question. One of the issues becomes, what kind of international machinery do we have that actually is working to end hunger? Now, there's lots of different organizations that work to end hunger, right? There's a lot of NGOs. There's the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, CGIAR, that does specific research on different crops. There is, of course, the World Food Program, which mostly, although it wasn't designed this way, mostly helps people living in the midst of disastrous humanitarian programming. There's the International Fund for Agriculture Development that provides loans to governments working in agriculture. There's the Food and Agriculture Organization that is involved in just about every aspect of research and some level of implementation on food security issues. UNEP, the environmental program, UNDP, there's lots of organizations that do a little bit of this. UNICEF works to end hunger with children. So why are the numbers going up? What is it that these organizations can do to make a difference beyond? But also, we even want to ask a question, and Rockefeller Foundation has recently given a grant to the Kofi Annan Foundation to ask the question, what is the role of international organizations, the international machinery in ending hunger? Do we have the right machinery in place? If any of these organizations went away tomorrow, would the numbers go further up or not? And if we were going to rethink the system from scratch, is this what we would create? I don't have answers to any of those questions, but we think that in this context of discussion, they should be asked because it's unconscionable that so many more hungry people. There are some reasons that are very difficult to deal with always, especially because of the dire poverty that so many people find themselves in. But when we get to the point, what can we collectively do about it? Have we looked closely enough to what the governments should be doing that they already agreed to do? To what the international organizations are doing, is that enough? And ultimately then, we come back to the people and to your earlier question. What can we do?
And to be fair to the international sphere, this cannot happen without governments and communities taking their own share of responsibility. In the same report, there are 2 points that really resonated with me. One was, do we care enough about collecting and analyzing data on how governments are moving along the spectrum of all the targets in SDG 2? Are we watching? Are we calculating, combining data sets there? And there was another point that also was linked to, how do we place attention to what should be a relentless focus on meeting critical human needs by governments? So the one thing that I really stayed with me from that IFPRI report is the sentence that said basically, human needs are as critical as food insecurity and healthy diets should be the object of relentless focus at governmental level. And so just wanted to bring up this governmental and national dimension to the interlocks with international dimension. There cannot be success only from the international sphere. Do you agree on that? What is your experience telling you about that, concomitance of national and global?
Every UN organization, of course, is a functionary of governments somehow. And whether every government sits on their board like the Secretariat or like FAO, or whether a subset of governments sits on the board like of WFP, UNICEF, UNDP, UNHCR, one of them is an intergovernmental body. How they do well or how they fail, or to fix them if they need fixing. I'm not saying anybody does at this point or whatever, but it is, to your point, it is the government's responsibility ultimately. They are the board. They are the donors. So that's critically important. Of course, NGOs, it's different. After all, they're called non-governmental organizations, so they have different boards and they're not beholden to governments unless it's because of the donations that they receive. Yes, we don't really collect data about how individual governments are doing. We don't. So even though the governments have all made commitments, as is shown in the IFPRI report, to various aspects of things that we're all going to do in order to work towards zero hunger, they haven't done them. Almost no one has done them. And so when we look at these human needs and having healthy diets, we all agree that's a goal, but it's a long way from saying that that's a goal to achieving it. In order to achieve it, one has to take concrete actions along the way. The new government in Brazil with President Lula has already made some statements about programs that they're not only going to do, but that they're going to propose to G20. And this is a very important initiative that we'll all be looking at to see how well any of these ideas are picked up. It's much like what the Italians did in the G7 in L'Aquila back in 12 years ago, maybe, or 15 years ago, during the height of the food price crisis in the 2008, 9, 10, where the G7 made commitments about what was going to be done in order to end hunger. And some of those commitments were actually moved forward. The U.S. created a program called Feed the Future, which added additional resources to some of their programming in some countries in the Global South. But we need a new boost for all of those countries, all of the donor countries.
And indeed, one of the reports that we talked about in this episode basically overall gives pessimistic view that says roughly, even for something so basic, so important, so acute, so relevant for every human being, where solutions exist, even then, it is a struggle to generate momentum forward towards, implementing a vision as contundent, simple, and clear as zero hunger. Isn't that frustrating?
Yes, and the IFPRI report talks about that. We know from research certain things that work. Why aren't we doing them? That's really what they say in nice scientific language. Where are we and why aren't we doing something? What I fear is the prospect of some countries getting so mired into poverty and hunger that will have a big impact on violence. It already probably is in many countries. And then it would potentially be something that could overthrow the government or could at least make unrest so problematic that security becomes the one big issue and people get even more hungry. I hope that we are able to take some collective action before things like that happen. But remember when the so-called Arab Spring started, that's a lot of the reason. The food was too expensive and too unavailable. People went to the streets to say, no, this is no good. So when are we going to figure out the time is now before we repeat history?
As we wrap up this episode, I wanted to go back to the various Catherines, in a way, all the experience that you have had in this area. You dedicated a lot of your professional life to food security, insecurity, and hunger. And now you have presided, if I could use that word, to the organization of these groups of discussion that then gave birth to these reports. And we'll put all the links so that our audience can actually access the report and read them and have an opinion for themselves. How would you conclude an episode like this, where we know there are solutions, but the problem is still there? The figures are going the wrong way, just to quote you a few minutes ago. And yet, is there something that you could leave with our audience that could give us, motivation, hope, or a view that wouldn't remain mired in pessimism?
Right. That is always the problem dealing with hunger, is leaving on a pessimistic note. And those of us who have been involved in this for a long time are not here because we like banging our head against the wall. We're here because we want to find solutions and we believe they exist. And in fact, they're not difficult. So I would say, first of all, to anybody who's listening who's affiliated with a government, look at what commitments your government has made, whether you're from the North or the South. What commitments has your government made to ending hunger, and how is their progress? And if you can't easily find it out, then write to some person in the government somewhere and ask them. And if you don't hear from that person, write to another one and write to another one. Let them know that you care about this and you want to know what they're doing. And if you could multiply that action by others, please do. Because it is ultimately going to be governments who have the major steps forward in fixing these problems, whether they're taking care of the hungry, poor people in their own country or whether they're donating somewhere else. Governments have the major involvement in this. So first and foremost, please hold the government accountable for what they've already said they do, because if they actually did the things that IFPRI talks about in their paper, we would be further along and the numbers would not necessarily be increasing. Second, I would say another government issue, if you want to go in that direction, is to talk to governments about putting political will behind ending wars and conflicts. Not everybody is hungry because they're living amidst war. It's mostly because they're poor. But think about all of the wars that are going on today and how intractable some of them are. And again, try to influence your own government for their involvement, whether it's through the UN or on a bilateral basis, on those capacities. Then I think, finally, we all can do more because we all can do something in our own community where there's people that are hungry. We can do something to support international organizations who are working for people who are hungry. And all of that matters because every single dollar or franc or euro or pound or shilling that it's contributed to an NGO, it makes a huge difference over time for what that organization is able to do to end hunger. So there's a lot of things that we can do. There are policy issues, there's hands-on issues, and there's donations, even very small ones. Because we know that we can decrease hunger. It has happened before. If you look at the charts, and the IFPRI paper will show you, the numbers were going down. So much so that we thought there'd be zero hunger by the SDG end at 2030. That's what we thought, 2015. So what can we do to turn this around? Together, we can turn that around.
Well, Catherine Bertini, thank you so much for coming back in our studio and telling us more about how to move towards zero hunger. Thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.